Hey guys, and welcome back. So we're on the tail end of finishing up that walnut bedside table that maybe you've seen in some of the previous videos. And over this Christmas, my brother has asked if I could put together a coat rack for his new home. So this coat rack design I'm going to be doing is going to be using some leftover walnut from the bedside table build, along with some oak that I've been using in trim around the house. As you've seen in some of the other videos with the home remodeling projects, I've got oak that's been used for trim around the windows and doors, as well as some of the floorboards throughout the house, and so I've got an odd assortment of leftover oak pieces that I'll be using. The approach I'm going to use for this is to put together a box frame of laminated walnut and oak pieces that'll create the central post of this coat rack. As you had seen, I started off with the two main sides that already have the walnut laminated to them. I've cut some small block to create spacers within the cavity of this boxed frame, and then I'm going to be gluing up with the final two pieces of oak to create the sides of this. It was a little bit tricky to actually clamp everything in place just given the hardware and tools I have on hand, but one of the methods I used was to place the boards in a way that those that were bowing would bow outwards so that I could compress them inwards towards the blocks. Moving on from the boxed frame, I started to design and put together the actual coat hooks that would install further up the neck of the boxed frame. So these pieces were created using some 3/4 inch oak that were laminated together to create a 1.5 inch wide block. I wanted to have a tapered angle to them, as well as kind of a tapered profile so that they would be wider at the base and narrower at the tip where they're higher up and holding the actual clothing. My original design called for an inclined edge on the bottom face of these coat hooks, and so in order to accomplish this I used my saw sled with a small block screwed in place at the proper angle. Once I had that main edge cut, I moved over to my bandsaw where I cut out the finger portion, the upward pointing hook portion of these coat hangers. With the general shape of the coat hangers cut out, I then adjusted the block on my sled so that it was the proper angle for the vertical taper of the blocking. Now this was a little bit scarier cut, maybe I'll call it, just because it was such a narrow piece of wood. At one end it was 1 inch, and at the other end it was tapered back to the 1.5 original thickness of the board. I did this to both sides, essentially just mirroring the setup on my saw sled. All that to say, once I had these actually mocked up and held in place temporarily on the main column of the coat rack, I decided, they were just too bulky. They stuck out kind of looking like a telephone pole, and so I ended up cutting about 2 inches off at 25 degrees so that I had an upward tapering angle. At the same time, I decided I didn't really care for this finger feature at the end of it, and so I ended up cutting that off as well, but cutting the end of them at an angle that matched the 25 degrees. While I generally like to model up the approaches that I'm going to be doing, this was kind of one I found hard to visualize in full size. It's one thing when you see it on a computer screen, but different when you're actually standing next to it. So even though this caused me a little bit of rework, I'm still able to make use of these pieces of oak for the coat hangers, and I still like the tapered look where they're a little bit wider at the base and skinnier at the tip. The new shape looks a little bit more sleek as well, and it only cost me about a day's worth of extra time on these. Not too terrible. To put a small top cap on the column, I'm using a leftover piece of the walnut, cut with just an inch overhang on each side from the overall column width. And then I'm doing a similar taper to what I had done on that walnut bedside table. Once I had seen it on that build, I kind of liked the look of it and wanted to replicate it here. So essentially it's a 25-degree angle that gets cut on the edges so that you're left with about a 3/8 inch thick remaining edge. The legs of this coat rack are going to have an arch shape to them. Now, arches are something I always have had a difficult time reproducing, at least consistently in wood, because of the difficulty with cutting an arch shape and then sanding and smoothing everything so that it has the same overall look. In talking this over with my brother-in-law, who's also into carpentry, the idea that he had mentioned to me was to create a template that I could then use a router bit with an edge finder on it so that I could use the router to give me the shape that I'm looking for. The first step of this process is to obviously have your template tuned to the shape that you want, which is easy to do with a piece of veneer that you can sand so that you have a nice smooth curve. Once you trace this onto the piece of your 3/4 inch thick material, in my case the coat rack legs, I cut just outside of that line so that once I'm done with my bandsaw cutting, I can put the template back in place with some pieces of double-sided tape. Then all I have to do is take this to my router table, and with the edge finding bit, I can route right up to that template, and I should have a nice smooth surface all the way around the perimeter of this leg. I found this to be a pretty nice trick. I know I've done this before on previous projects, but sometimes I get stuck in my ways, and so it was a nice reminder to use this as an approach. Each of the legs got a round over so that you have a nice smooth shape, and I've sanded everything, so I like the overall look of these legs. I'm laying them out onto the post now to see where I'm going to cut a channel so that I can fit the top end of these legs into the base of the post. Now this is something where I'm just tracing around the shape. I'm going to use my handheld router to cut the groove into place, and then I'll use a chisel to kind of clean up the edges. One of the things I've been finding is kind of a nice trick is to cut the slot a little bit narrow and then use one of my my rabbet planes to cut a slight recess in the leg itself, so that when the two are pressed together, the wood overlaps and you shouldn't see as much of a gap in your joinery. Knowing that my next step was to glue the legs in place along with the coat hangers, this was my last chance to do any kind of shaping to the main post with my router. I ended up deciding to do a slight chamfered edge just through the walnut portion so that the walnut was now divided into roughly 3/8 of flat versus chamfered edges. I thought this was kind of a nice way of breaking up some of the blockiness of that main post. To help balance out the wood color from bottom to top of this overall coat rack, and also to add some structural rigidity to the overall length of the legs, I created these small walnut bracing pieces that are just made of 1.5 inch by 3/4 thick pieces of walnut left over. I rounded everything over with the same 1/4 inch round over so that everything was pretty consistent from top to bottom. When installing the coat hangers, I'm using some 3-inch long cabinet screws with very small heads in them, something that I can bury into the wood so it's difficult to see them once covered over, with that same glue and sanding technique that I've done elsewhere. Well guys, I've said it before and I'll say it again here, I really appreciate putting the polyurethane or oil onto a finished project. It really brings the wood grain out and allows you to see kind of the characteristic and color of the wood. Here I'm using the same polyurethane that's the super flat or ultra flat that I had used on the walnut bedside table. I appreciate how it looked in that piece, and so I thought it might be a nice one for this as well. Well, I think I've eaten up enough of your time. I'm going to let you guys get back to it as I finish up this project here. I appreciate you guys tagging along till the end. Let me know if you have any questions or comments. I hope you guys learned something or at least got some inspiration for your own projects. We'll catch you on the next one. Bye.